we'll do the live thing for a sec. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Bigmark podcast. It's me, your host, Bigmark. If it's your first time listening to the podcast, welcome. If you want to support the podcast, go check us out at our Patreon at patreon.com/thebigmarkpod. You can follow us on Twitter, follow us on our Instagram at the Bigmark Pod and the Bigmark Podcast. Check us out, hit us up if you want to hear anything. If you have any comments, if you have anything to say about the podcast, if you want to hear a cool topic for me to do, like I say, if this is your first time listening, I like to do some of these solo ones that usually have a little bit more of a topic, a little bit more of a structure to it. And then I also love to have some guests on too. So anybody who wants to come on too, I love all y'all. I want you on. Please don't feel nervous about saying, I don't think I've got anything to say. We'd love to have you on. We'd love to talk because, again, it's like I love doing these solo ones, and it's almost like, there tends to be structure to it, like I mentioned, but, it's nice to have a guest on because I find that's even more free-flowing, which is super cool. Speaking of free-flowing, I'm going to talk a little bit about stand-up comedy today, and you know what? It's something that hasn't been really on everyone's mind. I mean, there's been specials and stuff over COVID that have come out, new specials that people have recorded and everything, which is super cool. But, obviously not being able to go to clubs and do stuff like that, at least in Canada, has been really difficult, I'm sure, on a lot of people who are stand-up comedians and the craft in general. But, stand-up comedy is one of those things where it's like, I feel like there are some corny stand-up comedians out there, and it ranges all the way to like super profound people who essentially like make serious change in the world and do all kinds of stuff like that. It's like any art form, any type of performance art, there tends to be a spectrum. I mean, again, you can kind of go for that general, popular vote, what everyone loves. You can kind of go right down the middle, general, whether it's slapstick comedy or just kind of observational humor. And then you can kind of go into a little bit more niche markets and stuff like that. So again, I think as the artist, you get to choose, choose who and how you want to talk to your audience. And I mean, sometimes that decision gets made for you, but I think a lot of times when you're deciding who you're gonna purvey your craft to, let's put it that way. I'm sure, like, let me just put it this way. In my personal experience, when I was in a band, we were thinking of, what kind of music we wanted to do. We wanted to do music that we like. So obviously it's going to kind of attract the certain person that, and potentially exclude others too, right? So I find anytime you're creating art, you don't want to necessarily, anticipate what your audience is necessarily going to do. I think doing and creating art that pleases you will eventually find its route, and people will, be attracted to it. People will come to it. So it's really interesting in the fact that, again, stand-up comedy is kind of morphed and changed from a lot of different things where, I didn't want to go too much into the history of it. I didn't look too much into that, but, you had orators back in the day. Throughout history, you had the oral tradition. I was just talking to a friend the other day. It's like, everyone's kind of worrying about the new bastion of social change that's gonna come, and what are things going to be like when there's all these new inventions. And every time something new and something groundbreaking and evolutionary happens, there's always an amount of people, there's a population of people, if you will, that's going to rail against it. And I read in ancient Greece, when they were first chiseling words into stone, and even early writings, they were really worried that we were going to lose this oral tradition, that our memory was going to be affected because we weren't using it all the time, because we were just using this easy thing to write things down. So it's always funny. It kind of reminds me of, teachers saying, you're not going to walk around with a calculator in your pocket, right? But well, look at us now. So again, I think stand-up comedy is part of that oral tradition. Again, stories. We love being told stories, and there's stand-up comedians out there that do bits, that do kind of sectional things, and there's no real flow per se to their act. It's really just free flowing, just firing on all cylinders. And each, like Mitch Hedberg, for instance, comes to mind. He's a great comedian. I encourage everyone to go check out all these comedians that I mentioned today. I'm going to mention a handful. It's not going to nearly, scratch the surface of all the different comedians out there. There's thousands, especially out throughout the ages. But again, some of the ones I mentioned, I encourage you to go check out their stuff. Thanks to YouTube and everything. I think even on Spotify there's specials now, but you can find albums, as they used to be called. Yeah, so like I said, go check some of these out. So again, Mitch Hedberg comes to mind, where it was just kind of one-liners. And then you also have stand-ups that do tell those stories, and they just kind of go up. Joey Diaz is one of my favorite comedians out there. Joe Rogan, who's also a stand-up comedian, but as everyone knows, the host of the Joe Rogan Experience, says that Joey Diaz is the funniest man alive. I think Joe Rogan loves Tim Dillon, who's another one who's very similar. Who's kind of like the next version of Joey Diaz, I think, in my opinion. But again, there's that more story-based acts where, it can be interesting, and you have to be a wizard, because that's when you're really using your words. And I think these guys do end up being wordsmiths. They're poets in long form in certain circumstances, and you can really make you laugh. I think I think I touched on it a little bit in previous podcasts, where one of the ways I remember learning this in my neuropsych course, when your brain makes a new connection, that's a reason why that's one of the reasons why we laugh, is our brain is making a new connection. And I think that is a really interesting thing, is that comedians are essentially showing you this whole new perspective, and your brain is kind of interpreting that as laughing. And I think there's also a big effect about being in a comedy club and stuff too, and that kind of amps things up. And usually when you're listening to a comedian audio, like whether it's on an album or somehow, there tends to be laughing along with it, so it gives you a little bit of a cue. But again, I think that's what some of the essence of being a comedian is, and being someone who's funny, is you're showing someone a new perspective on something, and a whole new way of thinking, which then in turn kind of makes your brain laugh in that way. I always kind of had an interesting experience with stand-up comedy. I'm not sure really how much my parents were into it. Like, I don't know if they listened to any classics, or if there was a comedian around, if they made time to go see them. They were huge into music, and they were more doing that kind of route. But there used to be this show on the Comedy Channel, and that's another huge thing in Canada, and so in the States too. They have the Comedy Network, and we had the Comedy Channel here in Canada, and showed all kinds of great stuff, all kinds of hilarious television, and some movies I think they show too. But anyway, one of the great shows that always used to be on, I'm pretty sure it used to be on like more or less right after school, if I remember correctly, was Just for Laughs. And essentially it was just like a taping of the Just for Laughs festival in Montreal. So the Just for Laughs festival in Montreal, this huge festival, it started in 1983, and it's now essentially established itself as kind of like the Cannes Film Festival of music, if you can put it that way. It's like comedians from all over the world come there, the best of the best. I believe you have to be invited there. And, you know, I don't think necessarily comedy has to be one way or another, but in comedy, they kind of look at clean comics and dirty comics obviously swear and talk about like more risque topics, and clean comics, you know, you can have your family there. Jim Gaffigan, he's one of the great clean comics out there, and it's so funny. You see these guys on podcasts and they don't always necessarily, they're not always the cleanest guys, but their acts are clean, which is interesting. And you know, again, that's what I was mentioning before, where they're probably going for a more, it is a larger audience, that kind of families and everyone still wants to be entertained. So again, that's the route, and it's not for everybody, but that's the route that some comedians choose. But anyway, at the Just for Laughs festival, they would tape everything, and I believe some people maybe did their specials. I highly doubt it. I don't know if there was like necessarily a winner or anything, but again, it was more or less, you know, again, just for more exposure, and you're invited there. It's a big stage. You get to put that on your resume. It's huge for the comedians. So anyway, as they're taping this, they also created the show. I'm not exactly sure when the show started, but it was always on TV when I was a little kid, even since I was a little kid. And again, it was tapings from whenever, usually that year, Just for Laughs, that year's Just for Laughs festival, JFL as they usually call it. But that was my big exposure to stand-up comedy, and it was just like I was kind of hooked. I just loved it. It was an interesting way. I mean, again, I wasn't in the clubs. Honestly, the craziest thing, I've never really, you know, even in my adult age, I've never been to like a comedy club. The only real stand-up comedian I ever saw was at the end of a open mic gig that me and my buddy did, and we were just like on our way out, and this stand-up comic was just about to hit. It was just like starting a couple jokes, and that was like the only, really straight up, the only time I've ever seen them. So the only true experience I ever had has been listening to them, watching them on Just for Laughs, and watching them on, you know, specials that I've downloaded or watched on Netflix and stuff. So again, to me, my classic experience with stand-up comedy is watching it on TV. So again, it's an interesting way to take it in. I think that there's probably something magical to seeing it live, but you know, it's kind of like watching a concert. But again, because you're sitting in the comfort of your own house, you get to watch it, and it gives you a little bit more time, I think, to really listen to these guys. And, you know, this JFL, Just for Laughs, used to show everything. It used to show, like, the prop comics, too, and guys that had, like, different gimmicks. But I loved those. I ended up loving those more storytelling comedians. One of my favorite comedians that was always on there, because he was Canadian, was Mike McDonald. Freaking hilarious guy. There's another Michael McDonald, actor and singer, funny enough. But anyway, Mike McDonald, just hilarious. I can probably recite some of his bits from memory still to this day, but you know, just his physicality and his wit and his demeanor and his timing and his cadence, and see, like, these are all the things that kind of separate stand-up comedians, how they say their words, right? Because, you know, anyone can kind of go up and say something funny, and there are also comics that, you know, they're more performers, and they also have ghostwriters and people writing, their comedic writers that do more behind the scenes kind of writing, just like in music as well. I think it's really interesting that again, you have these artists, these comedians, you know, trying to captivate you for a certain amount of time. I don't think that they had longer than 20-minute sets usually, like even for the biggest dudes. And you know, what I saw on TV was probably like really edited down. So again, it was like, you know, really interesting seeing all these guys come up. There's many more. Again, I just wanted to shout out Mike McDonald. He's just, I'm just kind of reminiscing a little bit, and it's kind of, some of these things just kind of like on last week episode of Kenny on Kenny versus Spenny. These were formative times in my life, right? And I spent a lot of time watching these and having fun. My old man used to watch them with me, and he used to love watching some of these stand-ups. And again, it helps kind of form your comedy and stuff. And there are many similarities between music and stand-up. I think actually historically you see a lot of musicians hang out with stand-up comedians. Sam Kinison's a very famous kind of rock and roll comic who kind of like went through both worlds and was just out in the public eye. And again, just historically speaking, you're performing, and even athletes too, there's this performance art where everyone kind of can understand what it's like to go up in front of a bunch of people and do their thing. And one of my biggest issues with other bands that I've worked with in the past is not necessarily a willingness to go out and work the craft. And that was really tough because, again, growing up with somewhat knowing about a little bit about stand-up and understanding what was going down, and watching and listening to Joe Rogan's experience and him talking about his career as a stand-up comedian, the biggest thing that always used to stand out to me, and this is something I took from sports too, is you got to practice, you got to get out there, and you got to work your craft. And the only way you can work your craft in a certain way is actually playing. Now, playing football, you can't really play that many games, so most of it happens in practice. I totally understand. But basketball, the real, true honing of your game, because again, you want to be able to perform in the game. That's where the most important place is. Obviously, it makes sense. So when you're playing in a band, the most important place is to be on stage, because you can rehearse and do your own thing, and you're going to be bang on, especially with the other people in your band that are your friends and you're probably really comfortable with. You got to get in front of strangers. And the biggest thing that's similar to comedians is they get out there and they work their set, and that's the exact same thing. And it's funny, I think Joe Rogan said this: you can write a song musically in your basement by yourself, you and a guitar, you and a piano. Basically, it's going to come out pretty good if it sounds good to you. Like, unless you're like really out of it and you've just like totally missed the mark, someone's going to be like, wow, that's a nice, like, fully formed song. That makes sense. You can draw a picture on your own, do your thing. But comedians tend to have to work their craft. They have to work their material. They have to see if shit is funny, because a lot of stuff might be funny to you and might not be funny to other people. So you have to get in front of people. You have to show it. And if you bomb in the stand-up comedian world, for everyone listening who doesn't know, bombing means you went out there and no one laughed. The thing just fell like a bomb and just killed everybody, and no one laughed in the worst way. And it's probably horrible. I mean, I'm sure we can all think of a moment where we tried to tell a joke and it landed flat. It's probably just like that, but like way worse, because there's like a room full of people. And however, it's got to be a huge learning experience, because then okay, how do I tweak this joke? And then you get to go out and you get to try it again. And there's open mics all the time, and you keep going and keep going. And I think, again, you can do that as a musician, and you can play a song, and if everyone starts talking and you can hear the drinks clinking and people are going and ordering more shit, you can go, okay, shit, this isn't really grabbing people's attention the way I wanted to. How can I kind of tweak this a little bit, right? And again, that comes from just getting out there and honing your craft. And, I think that, and there's many other similarities between comedy and music, and getting out on the road, doing your thing. Of course, performancing. It's a type of performance art, like I mentioned before. Again, the similarities are endless. But again, I think there are those differences, like I mentioned before. It's something that you can't really, comedy is something you really can't do on your own. It's one of those things that you have to do it, and you have to be able to get in front of people and do it. And I think, again, with COVID and doing all this stuff, not to keep harping on that forever and ever, like everybody, it must have been really tough on these comedians, because I think they were doing Zoom stuff before, which must have been a fucking nightmare. And again, you know, these guys have to be in front of people, these guys and girls and everyone, you know what I mean, have to get in front of people, and they have to get that feedback, get that feeling of people laughing again, and feeling of lifting them up. Because when a comedian gets up on stage too, there's actually, in certain circumstances, if they have the time, there's a bit of improvisation that can happen when you're kind of in the flow, because it's a flow state. Again, you know, not to mention another similarity, but there's a flow state aspect to it, where you can see certain comedians where they're open enough and they're experienced enough and they feel comfortable enough in their craft that the funny is just kind of coming from another space, and it keeps flowing and just nonstop, one thing after another keeps flying. And I think, you know, that channel is something beautiful to behold. You know, you're kind of witnessing a spiritual event in certain circumstances, right? You're seeing this person, you know, again, experience a thing that is a two-way event with you and the audience, and they're laughing and back. Not even just crowd work where the comedian talks directly to the audience. It's just laughing, and there's an energy thing. And again, I'm only speaking, I'm not even speaking with the experience of being in a comedy club, but I can only imagine from my own experience with music and just watching and feeling my own experience listening to some of these comedians, because that's the other thing. You can just listen to them. You don't have to see them, and it's still funny. John Panette who's a great comedian, has this one album called Show Me the Buffet, and it's hilarious nonstop, and I've only listened to it. I've never seen him actually perform it live, and it's always been near and dear to my heart and hilarious. But again, you know, a lot of these comedians out there, your Richard Pryors, your Lenny Bruce, they were early. They were kind of more pioneers. And, you know, as comedy kind of changes and morphs, the comedians kind of change too. And again, the style is always there. You know, I mentioned Lenny Bruce kind of because he was kind of one of the early guys, if we want to talk about, you know, a bit of history there, where he was doing stuff that, if you listen to it today, doesn't sound all that funny, but at the time was groundbreaking. He was swearing. I think he went to jail for profanity. And then you go into Richard Pryor, who's a black comedian, who all of a sudden all these people are loving him. And at the time, in the late 70s, you know, this is where, you know, there's still some race relation things happening in the world, which is awful. But again, this Richard Pryor was able to kind of transcend things, and you know, that there's so many. That was kind of another big thing that kind of led me to find new stand-up comedians, is because I love movies. A lot of stand-up comedians are also actors. So, you know, again, Richard Pryor's in tons of movies that I like, and you know, he's in lots of movies with Gene Wilder. And it's just, again, seeing them, and the movies being so hilarious, you think, wow, how could these, and it's not always a one-to-one scenario, but again, a lot of these comedic actors started as stand-ups too, right? So kind of all works together, you know, all these things, the comedic kind of like zeitgeist, if you will, in Hollywood. You know, everyone's kind of working together, and I think that still kind of exists today. And there's always been underground comics, and there'll always be mainstream comics and everything like that. Super cool. What I mentioned before, that you have bit comics, you have prop comics too, that use literal props. on stage to kind of make people laugh, and you have storytellers. You also kind of, in that storyteller vibe, there's also a lot of comedians out there that kind of make you think. They kind of transcend comedy, so to speak. They're, in their stories, yeah, they tend to be funny, but again, they're in their attempt to shift your perspective to make you laugh. They tend to shift your perspective so far that it kind of takes you past the laugh and into this realm of deep thought where it's like, wow, that's something maybe I never thought of. And it's almost like reading a new book or reading an article. But again, this person's talking to an audience, and sometimes they can connect with you to the point where they feel like they're almost talking straight to you. And, one of the biggest examples for me anyway is Bill Hicks. And I've mentioned him many times on the podcast relating to psychedelics, but, he's one of the best comedians out there. He started when he was like 16 or something, really, really, really young, like too young to drink. And he was like up on stage doing his thing, cutting his teeth. He was already like kind of like a seasoned comedian by the time he was in his 20s. And so I think he kind of went through all those kind of bit jokes and more, I wouldn't say pedestrian, but again, more that pure just for laughs kind of thing, into that kind of mode of deep thought and trying to open people's minds. It sounded like he came from, so there's a great documentary called The Bill Hicks Story. A lot of the information I know about him is from this documentary. And it sounds like he came from a relatively strict family. He's from Texas. And again, I think, it's funny when when you have really strict parents or maybe even really religious parents. Unless you totally buy into it, you tend to totally not, and you tend to totally rail against it and try and find new ways of thinking. And if anything, every aspect of your life tends to become antithetical to the status quo, at least of what your parents created. And maybe that goes for a lot of people, strict or not. But, I think someone like Bill Hicks coming from a strict family, him exploring some of these ideas that were presented to him in a new way allowed him to create some of the comedy that he did, looking at things differently and trying to understand things in a new light, because his parents were laying things down to him in a way that he didn't understand, kind of brought him to think, man, there's got to be different people. He met new friends. They ended up, I think he wasn't really doing he was, I don't want to speak out of turn here, but Bill Hicks was a big user of psychedelic psilocybin mushrooms too, and he was a big follower of Terence McKenna, and him and his friends would go on kind of retreats and really think spiritually about their use with psychedelics. And again, that was a big part of his act. That was a big thing where, I've always said it's just a ride, and that whole bit is a Bill Hicks bit where, again, he talks about life being like a roller coaster that you can get on. There's lots of ups and downs. There's thrills and chills. But again, it's just a ride. And the more we realize that it's a ride, the less we can be focused on our differences and focused on how crazy and how the ride's making us feel, because again, we kind of forget that it's a ride, and we buy into it. And then there's people that come out that know it's a ride, and they come out and they come off the ride and they tell us, hey, don't forget, it's just a ride. And Bill Hicks in his bit goes, and what do we do to those people? Well, we end up killing those people. So again, this is where Bill Hicks tended to be a little bit more. It wasn't blatantly funny. It was almost like there was a shock value to it. And there's lots of comedians like that. Again, Sam Kinison was almost more of that kind of shock comic. George Carlin is more of that thought-provoking comedian too, in the same vein as Bill Hicks. And again, it's that whole idea that once we do realize that this is a ride, and Bill Hicks is telling us that, once we realize that we put too much stock kind of into this reality, the less we do, and the less we kind of treat everyone, we can all treat each other like we're one and realize that we're all together, and then we can explore inner and outer space together forever. And I think that that's one of the most special things. I remember listening to that over and over early in my psychedelic journey, because again, it's just very reassuring to know that there's other people out there that think like you, and that there is hope. There's always a hope aspect at the end of Hicks's things, even though they tend to be shocking. And I think that was part of his MO. This is what stand-up comedians do. They give you a new perspective, and it's not always a comfortable perspective, but it's going to be a new one. And, I think their stand-up comics are continuing the tradition of the court jester to go all the way back. The court jester was an important part in medieval courts, I guess, that they added levity to things because times were dark, but they were the only people who could really go to the king and tell them really what was going on to their face. And they did it in jest, literally. They did it jokingly, and, maybe they made themselves look the fool, but really they knew the most and tended to be extremely intelligent, but invaluable to the king or queen, because they provided information to them in a package that the king and queen could accept. And it wasn't, the pretense was gone. It wasn't insulting to the king and queen. It was anyone, if anyone else said the same thing, they would have been killed. But because the court jester did it, you could get away with it. And again, I think stand-up comedians today are in that same line. And there's something really important to that, because now they provide that commentary to the rest of the community, the rest of us, not just to the kings and queens. They tell us, hey, this is what's going on. This is how I see the world. Each person has their own unique interpretation, and every comic out there is going to have a little bit of a tidbit that's a little bit closer to the way you're doing it. And you'll go out there, you're going to find your favorite comedian. You're going to listen to them. Now we live in this world of podcasting. Almost every comic has a podcast. It's beautiful. You can find more about them. You can listen and be funny on these other podcasts too, and it's so cool. And hopefully now with restrictions starting to come up, we can start getting people back and starting doing comedy and everything. I know Tom Segura is coming back up to Canada, which is super cool. Shout out Big Tommy Buns. And, again, if you've never really gotten to comedy, go check it out. Dave Chappelle has some amazing specials. I could list this thing forever, but just go check out and find your favorite comic, get into it, and keep laughing, because that's all we can do these days, and just start bringing up everybody, because we're all one. It's just a ride, and we're all going to get through this together. Laughter is the best medicine, right, folks? So, you know what I mean? Thanks for listening. I love all you guys. If you want to support the podcast, check out our Patreon, patreon.com/thebigmarkpodcast. Follow us on Twitter. Follow us on Instagram. Tell your friends. If you go out and tell one friend, we'll immediately double the audience. I love all you. I love all you around the world. Thank you for listening. Thank you for taking the time. And like I said, go find somebody and make them laugh. Love you all. Talk to you soon. Peace.